heard, my name is Darragh O'Sullivan, and I'm a fourth-year Sport and Exercise Sciences student. And I'm going to be presenting on one part of my final year project where I examine the differences in anxiety and depressive symptoms based on physical activity screen time interactions among Irish adolescents. Okay, sorry, no, it's just slow. There we go. So anxiety and depression are two common groups of mental health disorders, and anxiety is defined as unpleasant feelings of tension, apprehension, and or worry. And it's actually a protective, adaptive response, but anxiety is present in the absence of any real or obvious danger, and if it becomes severe or chronic, then it becomes maladaptive or disordered. On the other hand, depression is primarily characterized by an increased in sad mood or an increase in loss of interest. And then some, but not all, of the secondary characteristics include reduced concentration, increased suicidal ideation and fatigue, hyperinsomnia or insomnia, and excessive guilt as well. And then common treatments for anxiety and depressive disorders include cognitive behavioral therapy and pharmacotherapy, such as antidepressant drugs. But the efficacy and effectiveness of both of these have been questioned. For example, both can be quite expensive, inaccessible, and negative side effects can occasionally occur with antidepressants as well. And adolescents are a particularly at-risk group for developing anxiety and depressive disorders, and recent research has suggested that the COVID-19 pandemic is likely worsening adolescent mental health. And this figure on the right here, if you look at the red line, indicates that anxiety disorders commonly first develop in adolescence. And although depressive disorders more commonly develop in adulthood, we see a roughly linear increase in their prevalence starting in early adolescence. Adolescence is also a critical period of mental and behavioral pattern development. So these disorders, they can have adverse consequences for academic achievement, social adjustment, and even adulthood mental health as well. And the current evidence, which is mostly cross-sectional, suggests inverse associations between physical activity and anxiety and depression, meaning as physical activity increases, anxiety and depressive symptoms decrease. And the evidence also suggests positive associations between screen time and anxiety and depressive symptoms. So as screen time increases, so do anxiety and depression. So there has been some limited research on physical activity and screen time's individual implications for anxiety and depression among adolescents. But few have examined both physical activity and screen time levels concurrently. So the aim of this research was to examine the differences in anxiety and depressive symptoms based on physical activity, screen time interactions among Irish adolescents. And as for our methods, this was a cross-sectional study, and the data was collected from 1,756 students in Irish secondary schools since 2015. A battery of questionnaires was used to measure physical activity, screen time, anxiety, and depression. And for physical activity, the students were asked on how many days had they accumulated at least 60 minutes of moderate to vigorous physical activity, both during the previous 7 days and during a typical week. And then we took the average of the two. Screen time exposure was measured individually for specific screen time modalities, and those were TV watching, computer and phone use. And now we only looked at weekend or weekday screen time. So participants were asked to report their average time per day spent watching TV, using a computer and using their phone on weekdays. And then anxiety and depression were measured using reliable and well-validated questionnaires, the State Trait Anxiety Inventory and the Quick Inventory of Depressive Symptomatology. Then we categorized physical activity and screen time as either low, moderate, or high. Low physical activity was accumulating at least 60 minutes of moderate to vigorous physical activity on 0 to 2 days per week. Moderate was 3 to 4 days per week, and then high was 5 or more days per week. Low screen time was less than or equal to 2 hours per day. Moderate was 3 to 4 hours, and then high was 5 or more hours per day. And finally, we created the physical activity screen time interaction variables, where we identified participants that, for example, concurrently had low physical activity and low screen time, or low physical activity and moderate screen time, and so on. And then we analyzed the differences in anxiety and depressive symptoms between those interactions. And these are our results for depressive symptoms, and the bars represent the mean symptoms for the various interactions. And there's a lot going on here, but noticing the general trends is the most important thing for the purpose of this presentation. And what we can see straight away is that regardless of the screen time modality, the participants that had high physical activity levels and low screen time had the lowest depressive symptoms. Also, with physical activity kept constant, there were dose response increases in depressive symptoms as screen time increased, with some mixed findings for TV watching. And therefore, the opposite can also be said. So when screen time decreased, there were dose response reductions in depressive symptoms for people with lower screen time levels, again, with some exceptions for TV. Alternatively, and again, with some TV exceptions, with screen time levels remaining the same, we found that those with higher physical activity levels had dose response reductions in depressive symptoms. And this was consistent for moderate screen time and high screen time as well. So regardless of the screen time level, in general, those with higher physical activity had lower depressive symptoms. And the results were for anxiety were for the most part the same. Again, regardless of the screen time modality, the high-low group had the lowest anxiety symptoms. And although there were some mixed results for the low physical activity groups, those with moderate and high physical activity showed dose response increases in anxiety with increased screen time. And again, the reverse can also be said. And with screen time kept constant, at low screen time, we saw a reduction in anxiety with increased physical activity levels, and the same for moderate screen time. And some mixed findings for those with high screen time, but the high phone use group did also show reduced anxiety with increased physical activity. So our most obvious finding is that adolescents with high physical activity and low screen time had the lowest anxiety and depressive symptoms. And this is consistent with the results of one of the few previous studies done on this topic, which was in Chinese adolescents. But maybe this gold standard recommendation might be a bit unrealistic for some people. There might be a reluctance to either increase physical activity or, especially in today's world, reduce screen time. But our dose response findings suggest that even subtle increases in physical activity levels or subtle decreases in screen time might have anxiety and depressive symptom reducing benefits, regardless of how good or bad their other lifestyle behavior is. And here we also have some of the purported underlying mechanisms by which physical activity and screen time can impact anxiety and depression. So physical activity promotes serotonin secretion, which is a neurotransmitter linked with controlling mood. It promotes cortisol regulation, which contributes to better stress management. It also increases self-esteem and social interaction, which both have protective effects against anxiety and depression. Screen time, on the other hand, can contribute to sleep disruption by dysregulating melatonin, a sleep-promoting hormone, and the resulting lack of sleep can then contribute to anxiety and depression. It can also displace the time spent in face-to-face social interactions and the time spent doing physical activity. And then social comparisons, cyberbullying, etc., and something like social media can also contribute to anxiety and depression. And so this high physical activity, low screen time category should ideally be the recommendation, but even subtle changes in physical activity or screen time might be beneficial. And as for future research, firstly, more experimental and longitudinal research is needed. So the cross-sectional data is great because we can analyze very large groups with it, but we can't infer causality from it. So we can't definitively say whether physical activity levels and screen time are causing anxiety and depression or whether it's the other way around. And finally, future research should also differentiate between active and passive screen time. So active screen time is engaging and cognitively demanding screen times, such as learning or communicating, whereas passive screen time is mindlessly scrolling through your Facebook newsfeed. And learning and mindlessly scrolling are two completely different activities that can be done on the same screen. So that specific of screen time requires more attention in the research. And that's it from me, everyone. So thanks very much for listening. I can take any questions now if anyone has any.